This video is going to debunk Darryl Cooper's claims about Winston Churchill being the main villain of World War II, which he stated in an interview with Tucker Carlson. I have not heard about Darryl Cooper before, so I don't really know anything about him, and I don't care about speculating about his political views. What I, however, cannot tolerate is his outrageous claims and falsification about history. So in this video I will debunk his claims. Let's begin.
I'm American. I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to, they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that. And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities.
And that is exactly why calling Churchill the chief villain in World War II is completely absurd. If you want to measure who the greatest villain of the war was, then the number of atrocities, the number of victims, and who initiated the conflict are the obvious metrics.
But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland. Or just, at every step of the way, like people are very often, I find, surprised to learn. There's a two-step process.
Well,
right?
why don't you just make the case for that? Okay, so you've made your statement. A lot of people are thinking, well, wait a second. You said Churchill, my childhood hero, the guy with the cigar.
Yeah. Well, and the next thought that comes into their head is that, oh, you're saying Churchill was the chief villain, therefore his enemies, Adolf Hitler and so forth, were
Stalin,
the protagonists, right?
Yeah.
That they're the good guys if you think he's a villain. That's not the case. That's not what I'm saying.
The claim that Churchill was the main villain of World War II is objectively not true and not open to interpretation. Who bears the main responsibility for the lead-up, the outbreak, and the further escalations, as well as the responsibility for the worst and the most war crimes and atrocities, is not controversial. The ones responsible for the outbreak of war in Europe on the 1st of September 1939 is the German dictator Adolf Hitler, his regime and his generals. In Asia, the outbreak of war is the responsibility of the Japanese, and they were also the ones who caused US involvement in the Asia-Pacific War. What led up to the war in Europe was German expansion in Central Europe. The first expansion was the Tsar plebiscite, which was held in accordance with international law and planned long before Hitler came to power, so it doesn't really count. His move by military force was the remilitarization of Rhineland, where Hitler ordered German forces to move into the demilitarized zone in the Rhineland region. His next move was the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, which was also done with threats against the Austrian government, who initially did not want to submit, but were forced to accept Hitler's terms in March 1938. The next target was Czechoslovakia, where Hitler supported a local German Nazi party and used the German minority as a proxy to subvert the stability of the Czechoslovak state, with the goal of annexing the country. Hitler and his generals even drew up plans to invade and conquer Czechoslovakia. In the case of Czechoslovakia, Hitler used the Sudeten German party under the leadership of Konrad Henlein to stage provocations and terrorist attacks against the Czechoslovak police and Czech civilians. In mid-September 1938, Hitler established the Sudeten German Freikorps to start an insurgency, when Hitler was negotiating with Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister Daladier for a peaceful settlement to the Sudeten German problem. The fact is that the Western powers did nothing to stop Hitler during the remilitarization of the Rhineland and the annexation of Austria. In the Czechoslovak case, the British attempted to negotiate a compromise to prevent war, which ended in them completely dictating the Munich Agreement, where the Western powers basically forced the Czechs to give in to Hitler, in order to secure peace and exerted almost no pressure on Hitler to back off. The Munich Agreement basically abandoned all security assurances and alliances with countries in Central and Eastern Europe that could challenge Hitler. In 1939, Hitler and revisionist powers like Hungary took whatever they wanted from Czechoslovakia. In 1939, Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia under the threat of bombing Prague into ruins. He made Slovakia into a puppet state and let Hungary annex the eastern region of Carpathian Ruthenia. A few days later, Germany gave Lithuania an ultimatum to cede the Memel region to Germany. It was first after the complete breakup of Czechoslovakia that the British and French started opposing Germany actively and realized Hitler would not stop. They gave security guarantees to Poland, which was the obvious next target for Hitler, and on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler attacked Poland. The Western powers gave Hitler an ultimatum to withdraw. Hitler failed to respond and continued his aggression against Poland, and Great Britain and France finally declared war on the 3rd of September, honoring their alliance with Poland. Churchill was not even Prime Minister at the time Hitler invaded Poland. It was Neville Chamberlain who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time of the outbreak of World War II. Churchill did not become Prime Minister before May 1940. Churchill is not responsible for any escalation of the conflict. It was the Axis powers that escalated the conflict every time. It was Hitler who invaded Poland, it was Hitler who invaded Denmark and Norway, it was Hitler that invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, as well as France on the same day. By the way, the same day as Churchill became Prime Minister. It was Mussolini that invaded Greece in October 1940. It was Hitler who invaded Yugoslavia and Greece in the spring of 1941. It was Hitler that invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. It was the Japanese that attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 and then launched offensive against British and American territories in Asia and Pacific. It was Hitler that declared war on the US after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He might not say directly that with Churchill being the chief villain, that Hitler and the others were the good guys, but saying Churchill was the chief villain is basically saying that Hitler was not as bad as Churchill.
You know, Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler is chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that. And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead.
Yeah, that is what tends to happen when you put millions into camps that are hardly more than barbed wire in a field and let them die of starvation and disease. During the Battle of France in 1940, the Germans took an estimated 1.8 million prisoners of war. No more than 37,000, or 1 to 2.8%, died in German captivity. During the Second World War, maybe as many as 5.7 million Soviet soldiers were taken prisoners of war by the Germans. 3.3 million are estimated to have died. The number of British, American and other Western Allied prisoners of war who died in German captivity was fairly low. So it is clear that if the Germans wanted to save the lives of prisoners of war, they did have the possibility to do so. They simply chose not to. Because in contrast to Western Allied prisoners of war, the peoples in Eastern Europe were considered subhumans according to the Nazi racial ideology. He also mentions political prisoners. If by political prisoners he means the Soviet commissars, then there was a plan to deal with them. The commissar order, which said that Soviet political officers were to be shot when they were captured. This order was followed by the majority of the German units fighting in the East. I would also like to add that the German military plans in the East would inevitably lead to a huge number of prisoners. The historian David Glantz, who is an expert on the Eastern Front, states, "To achieve a quick victory, the Germans planned to destroy the bulk of the Soviet forces near the Soviet-Polish frontier. denying the Red Army any opportunity to retreat and to organize. The mass of the Red Army stationed in western Russia, meaning west of the western Dvina and the Dnieper rivers, is to be destroyed in bold operations involving deep penetrations by armored spearheads, and the withdrawal of elements capable of combat into the extensive Russian land spaces is to be prevented. In other words, the plan was to destroy the Red Army in the border areas in huge encirclement maneuvers, which inevitably means that unless they kill every Soviet soldier, this would mean millions of prisoners of war.
There, you have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now? And so this is like 2 months into the invasion, right? And like my view on this,
I don't know if he's trying to justify the mass murder of the Soviet prisoners of war or why he's even mentioning this. It has nothing to do with Winston Churchill at all. Although many Soviet prisoners were simply shot, the vast majority of the prisoners who died of starvation or disease, not from gunshots. Even if the Germans executed the prisoners, that would not be humane. Whether you starve 3.3 million people to death or shoot 3.3 million people, it is still mass murder, bigger than many genocides in history. The majority of the prisoners died in 1941 and early 1942, and it literally equals the Holodomor in Ukraine in terms of the number of victims.
I argue with my Zionist interlocutors about this all the time with regard to the current war in Gaza. Look, man, like maybe you, as the Germans, you felt like you had to invade to the east. Maybe you thought that Stalin was such a threat, or that if he launched a surprise attack and seized the oil fields in Romania, that you would now not have the fuel to actually respond and you'd be crippled and all of Europe would be under threat, and whatever it was that like maybe you thought you had to do that. But at the end of the day, you launched that war with no plan to care for the millions and millions of civilians and prisoners of war that were going to come under your control. And millions of people died because of that.
I just want to make a small correction here. Hitler did not invade the USSR without a plan to care about the Soviet prisoners of war. He invaded the USSR with a plan not to care about the millions and millions of prisoners of war. I'm not exactly sure what his point of mentioning this is, or what the deaths of the Soviet prisoners of war has to do with Winston Churchill, or how it proves that he was the main villain of World War II.
Right. And you can look at it and say like, so get back to your main question about Churchill. If you go to 1939, when the Germans and the Soviet Union invade Poland, as soon as that war's wrapped up on the German side, Hitler starts firing off peace proposals to Britain and France because they had already declared war. He didn't expect them to declare war, actually. Like there's a famous scene where he kind of throws a fit when he finds out that they did do that. And so he doesn't want to fight France. He doesn't want to fight Britain.
Then why did he attack a country that the British and French had guaranteed to protect and were in a de facto alliance with? Why did he not stop his invasion when he got an ultimatum from the Allies after the attack on Poland? Hitler knew of the guarantee to Poland.
He feels that's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the east, the communist threat over there. And he starts firing off peace proposals. He says, let's not do this. Like, we can't do this. And of course, a year goes by, 1940 comes around, and they're still at war. And so he launches his invasion to the west, takes over France, takes over Western and Northern Europe. Once that's done, and the British have, escaped at Dunkirk. There's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent. In other words, the war is over, and the Germans won. Okay.
Germany had won almost all battles so far, but not the war. The war ended in a total victory for the Allies. All Axis powers were defeated militarily by the Allies during the war. That would not have been the case if the Germans had won the war in 1940. It was still a year before the USSR became part of the war, and 1 year and a half until the United States became part of the war, so it is quite obvious that the Allies were not defeated in 1940. The British won the Battle of Britain in 1940. They won a huge victory in North Africa against the Italians in late 1940 and early 1941. They sank the Bismarck in 1941 and were able to defeat Italians in East Africa in 1941. They defeated the Vichy French in Syria and Lebanon, and they defeated the pro-Axis regime in Iraq in 1941. The British had plenty of capacity to continue the war.
But by what point?
Fall of 1940, right? So there's literally no opposing force on the continent. And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong, especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like, this is what's going on. And I think that if there were people in Britain who, if they hadn't, put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland.
The appeasement of Germany was widely popular, and Chamberlain and other appeasers indeed believed they had established peace in 1938 after the Munich Agreement. The appeasement policy was a disaster, no matter which version of the story you choose to believe. Whether you believe that he genuinely trusted Hitler and made a deal he thought would prevent a war, which is the case by the way, or you believe that it was just a way of buying more time for rearmament for the war that would likely come. Appeasement was a failure, and appeasement was tried until it was too late.
That people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War.
No one did, and that was the reason for the appeasement and why it was widely popular. However, some people understood that you had to stand up to Hitler, and that once the war was started, it had to be finished, and that Hitler was not a man you could negotiate with. But it was the Nazis that started the war.
Which is not what ended up happening, but that's what everybody thought was going to happen. And so Churchill, you have a guy, Churchill wanted a war. He wanted to fight Germany. And the reason that I don't begrudge him that, people can national leaders, you can fight whoever you want. If you feel like your the long-term interests of the British Empire are threatened by the rise of a powerful continental power like Germany, and you need to check that those are great power games, and you play them the way you feel like you need to play them. That's fine. The reason I resent Churchill so much for it is that he kept this war going.
Of course he did, and rightfully so. Great Britain was not defeated and kept fighting, and most of Europe was occupied. Why should they just surrender?
When he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just to burn down sections of the Black Forest. Just rank terrorism, going through and starting to, what eventually became just the carpet bombing, the saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods, to kill, is the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as possible. And all the men were out in the field. All the fighting age men were out in the field. And so this is old people, it's women and children, and they knew that. And they were wiping these places out. It was as gigantic scaled terrorist attacks, the greatest, scale of terrorist attacks you've ever seen in world history.
Why would he do that?
The Germans were the ones who started the aerial bombardments in the war. The first bombings in World War II happened against the Polish town of Wielun on the first day of the war. In the next weeks of the war, the Germans bombed several Polish towns and cities, killing tens of thousands of Polish civilians. During the Norwegian campaign, many cities and towns in Norway were bombed into ruins by the Luftwaffe, killing many civilians. German commanders also used threats of bombing of cities to intimidate the countries they attacked into surrendering. Rotterdam was bombed during the invasion of the Netherlands, killing hundreds of civilians in order to force a surrender. British cities were bombed, killing tens of thousands of civilians. Belgrade was bombed during the invasion of Yugoslavia. Many Soviet cities were bombed, killing tens of thousands of civilians. After the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, it would be extremely weird not to retaliate against Germany and try to cripple German industry. German war industry was vital to the German war effort, and it makes sense to try to neutralize it. Dresden, for instance, was actually a military target, not just a city full of civilians.
Because it was the only means that they had to continue fighting at the time.
That is not true, as I have mentioned earlier.
They didn't have the ability to reinvade Europe, and so he needed to keep this war going until he accomplished what he hoped to accomplish. We know now there's actually a really great series of books. It's one of the best. I recommend it to everybody, but it's really expensive now, and it's 6 long volumes called History of British Special Operations in the Second World War. And one of the books gets into the level of just the extent of media operations, propaganda operations, everything that they were running in the United States to eventually drag us into that war.
The US was dragged into the war by Japan attacking Pearl Harbor and other US military bases, as well as launching invasions in the Philippines and also against British holdings like Malaya, Singapore and Hong Kong. Hitler also declared war on the US first, so claiming propaganda made the US join the war is complete bollocks.
And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war is over. We need either the Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us, and that was the plan. And kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war.
Not really. Propaganda and media campaigns are important to any war effort.
And
what was the motive?
Well, Churchill's got a long and complicated history. I mean, he's somebody who
that was the wryest smile I think I've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, look, I think on one level, there was a sense that Churchill was sort of humiliated by his performance in the First World War as the head of the Admiralty, and he was out in the cold for a long time.
I mean, Gallipoli.
Yeah, and which that was his operation.
Yeah,
I mean, and so he was rightly held responsible for that and seen as responsible for one of the great disasters that the British suffered during that war. And so I think part of it was probably kind of personal. He wanted redemption. He wanted to go out there and prove that he's the warlord that they can go out there and fight this big war. Probably. I think part of it, I read about Churchill and he strikes me as a psychopath. But he's also he was a drunk. He was very childish in strange ways. People would talk about how as an adult, as prime minister, they'd find him in his room and he's playing with action figures like war toys and army men and stuff, and would get mad when people would interrupt him, when he was doing that. So this is a strange fellow,
I have never heard about this, but even if it was true, how is that even relevant? Even if he had strange hobbies, who cares? Also, playing with action figures and army men does not make you a villain or even a bad person.
There's all those things. But then you get into, why was Winston Churchill such a dedicated booster of Zionism from early on in his life, right? And there's ideological reasons. In 1920, he wrote a kind of infamous now article called Zionism versus Bolshevism. And he basically makes the case that, which was true to a large extent, that all of Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, which is where the vast majority of Jews lived, other than the United States, which is where a lot of them had traveled to, that area had become so engulfed by a revolutionary spirit that all the young Ashkenazi Jews who were over there were getting swept up into it. It was the 60s here on steroids, right? And in a much more serious and ended up being destructive way. And this is 1920, so this is shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. Basically, the point of his paper is he says these people who are over there, they're all going one direction or the other. They're going to be Bolsheviks. They're going to be Zionists. We want them to be Zionists, you know, and so we need to support this. And so that was early on. There was an ideological component of it. But then as time goes on, you know, you read stories about Churchill going bankrupt and needing money, getting bailed out by people who shared his interests, you know, in terms of Zionism, but also his hostility, just you know, I think his hostility to, put it this way, I think his hostility to Germany was real. I don't think that he necessarily had to be bribed to have that feeling. But, you know, I think he was, to an extent, put in place by people, the financiers, by a media complex that wanted to make sure that he was the guy who, you know, who was representing Britain in that conflict for a reason.
Why does he start talking about Zionism? Is his point that Zionists made Churchill start a war somehow? That an alliance between Jews and the British elite had forced Germany into the war was a conspiracy theory and a talking point used by the Nazis during World War II. I am not accusing Cooper of anything, but just saying. Basically everything Cooper says in this interview is completely false. I don't think his argument even makes sense at all or are even coherent. And they don't really add up to his conclusion that Churchill was the chief villain of World War II. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe.